There comes a moment in the avoidance journey when the comfortable narratives they've constructed begin to crumble. The relief they felt after the breakup starts to fade. The justifications that protected them from guilt lose their power. And slowly, painfully, the truth begins to penetrate their defenses. The person who once loved them, pursued them, and fought for them is never coming back. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in gradually through accumulated evidence and undeniable signs that the door has truly closed. When it finally lands with full force, it creates a psychological crisis that the avoidant is uniquely unprepared to handle. Their entire defensive structure was built to protect against the fear of abandonment, yet through their own actions, they've engineered the very outcome they spent their life trying to avoid. The hitting hard isn't just about loss, it's about the devastating recognition that they destroyed something irreplaceable and that no amount of belated realization can undo what's been done. When the permanence finally feels real. For months, perhaps even years, the avoidant has operated with an unconscious safety net, the belief that their former partner would always be available if they changed their mind. Even as they maintained distance and convinced themselves they were better off alone, somewhere deep in their psychology lived the assumption that the door remained open. But there comes a point when the permanence of the ending becomes undeniably real, and this realization hits the avoidant with devastating force. This moment often arrives not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of small, irrefutable evidence. The avoidant reaches out casually and receives a response so polite and distant, it's clear they're talking to someone who has emotionally moved on. They see their former partner living a full life that no longer includes space for them. They notice that the person who once made them central to their world now references them as part of their past rather than their present. Each piece of evidence builds until the reality becomes impossible to deny. The psychological impact is profound because it forces the avoidant to confront that they've lost control of the narrative. Throughout the relationship and the initial breakup period, the avoidant felt they held the power to determine the distance and the possibility of reconnection. They could withdraw, knowing their partner would wait. They could return, expecting to be welcomed back. But now they're facing a new reality. Their former partner has taken that power away by genuinely letting go. This permanence triggers a cascade of emotions the avoidant has spent years avoiding. There's panic as they realize that what felt like a controllable situation has become uncontrollable. There's grief as they begin to actually feel the loss they've been intellectualizing and minimizing. There's regret as they see clearly what they had and what they threw away through their inability to be emotionally present. All of these feelings hit simultaneously, overwhelming the avoidant's usual capacity to regulate through distance and rationalization. The avoidant also experiences a form of existential vertigo as they realize they've been operating under a false assumption. They thought they could always go back, that their former partner's love was an inexhaustible resource they could access whenever they felt ready. Discovering that this assumption was wrong forces a complete recalibration of their understanding of what happened. They didn't just step away from the relationship temporarily, they permanently destroyed someone's willingness to be vulnerable with them. This realization is particularly painful because it arrives too late to matter. The avoidant is finally ready to acknowledge what they lost, finally feeling what they couldn't let themselves feel before. But the person who waited patiently for this very realization has stopped waiting. The timing of their awakening is cruelly misaligned with the reality of their situation, leaving them with feelings they can't express and a desire to reconnect that has nowhere to go. Moreover, the permanence forces the avoidant to sit with discomfort they cannot escape through their usual methods. They can't withdraw from this pain because the pain exists in the space created by withdrawal. They can't create distance to feel safe because distance is what created this situation. They're trapped in a psychological corner of their own making, forced to feel the full weight of loss without any of their typical coping mechanisms available to soften the blow. When they realize you're not playing games, you've actually healed. One of the most devastating realizations for an avoidant is recognizing that their former partner's distance isn't strategic, isn't temporary, and isn't reversible. The avoidant has been interpreting their ex's behavior through the lens of manipulation or game playing, telling themselves that the silence and distance are tactics designed to make them jealous or regretful. But there comes a moment when the truth becomes clear. Their former partner isn't playing any game at all. They've genuinely healed, moved on, and released their attachment to the relationship. This recognition hits hard because it strips away the avoidant's protective interpretation of events. They can no longer tell themselves that their ex is still emotionally invested and just pretending otherwise. The evidence of genuine healing is everywhere, in the calm energy of their interactions, in the absence of any attempts to provoke jealousy or seek closure, in the way their former partner discusses them without anger or longing. This isn't performance, it's authentic emotional resolution. The avoidant experiences this realization as a loss of significance. They've always occupied a central place in their own narrative, convinced that their impact on others is profound and lasting. To discover that someone has genuinely healed from losing them challenges this self-concept. They're confronted with the uncomfortable truth that they were not as important or irreplaceable as they imagined themselves to be. Someone loved them deeply, lost them, grieved, and then moved forward into a healthier version of themselves. This recognition also triggers envy in the avoidant, an emotion they're not accustomed to feeling in relationship contexts. They see that their former partner has achieved something the avoidant struggles with constantly: genuine emotional healing, and the ability to move forward from loss. While the avoidant remains stuck in patterns of avoidance and intellectualization, their former partner has done the painful work of processing grief and emerging stronger. This comparison is unflattering and uncomfortable. The hitting hard intensifies when the avoidant realizes that healing means their former partner no longer needs them for closure, validation, or resolution. The avoidant might have unconsciously expected that their ex would remain in a state of unfinished business, perhaps hoping for eventual reconnection, or at least remaining emotionally available to process the relationship. But genuine healing closes those doors completely. There's nothing left unresolved, because their ex has resolved it all internally, without the avoidant's participation. Moreover, this realization forces the avoidant to confront their own lack of healing. While their former partner has grown and moved forward, the avoidant recognizes that they've simply been avoiding and defending. They haven't processed their feelings about the relationship or examined their patterns. They've used their usual strategies to stay emotionally numb, and now they're seeing the consequence. Their ex has grown beyond them, leaving them behind in their stagnation. The avoidant also experiences a painful recognition that healing means their former partner is now available for healthier relationships, while the avoidant remains trapped in the same patterns. Their ex has learned, grown, and become more secure in their attachment. Meanwhile, the avoidant is still running from intimacy, still protecting themselves from vulnerability, still unable to show up in ways that create lasting connection. The disparity in their emotional evolution becomes impossible to ignore. When they see you're happy, in ways they never made you. The avoidance awakening reaches a critical intensity when they witness their former partner experiencing happiness, peace, and fulfillment that was never present during the relationship. This isn't just seeing someone move on, it's seeing someone genuinely thriving in ways that make it painfully obvious that the relationship was limiting rather than enhancing their well-being. This observation forces a fundamental reassessment of the avoidant's role in their former partner's life. The avoidant sees their ex laughing with an ease they never displayed in the relationship. They notice a lightness in their energy, an openness in their body language, a joy that seems to radiate from deep within. The contrast is stark and undeniable. This person was carrying a heavy burden during the relationship, and that burden was the avoidant's emotional unavailability. The relief of being free from that burden is visible and heartbreaking for the avoidant to witness. This realization hits particularly hard because it contradicts the narratives the avoidant has been telling themselves. They convinced themselves that they were a positive presence in their ex's life, that the relationship had value despite its limitations, that they contributed something meaningful even if they couldn't provide emotional availability. But seeing their ex so much happier without them suggests something different, that their presence was actually diminishing their partner's capacity for joy and fulfillment. The avoidant is forced to confront that they weren't the prize they believed themselves to be. In their internal narrative, they were the one granting someone access to their limited emotional availability, the one being pursued, the one whose attention was valuable. But the evidence of their ex's increased happiness suggests they were actually dead weight, something their partner is visibly relieved to have released. This inversion of the power dynamic is psychologically destabilizing. There's also a specific pain in recognizing that they had someone who could experience this level of happiness, who had this capacity for joy, and they never created the conditions for it to flourish. The avoidant sees that the problem wasn't their ex's capacity for happiness. It was the avoidant's inability to create a relational environment where that happiness could exist. They had access to this vibrant, joyful person and managed to suppress those very qualities through their emotional distance and unavailability. The hitting hard intensifies when the avoidant realizes that their ex's happiness isn't just about the absence of pain, it's about the presence of new possibilities. Their former partner isn't just relieved to be free from an unfulfilling relationship. They're actively building a life filled with connection, purpose, and experiences they couldn't access while emotionally invested in someone who couldn't reciprocate. The avoidant sees opportunities their ex is now pursuing, relationships they're now cultivating, and a version of themselves they're becoming that was impossible to access during the relationship. Moreover, witnessing this happiness forces the avoidant to examine their own emotional state by comparison. They realize that while their ex is experiencing genuine joy and fulfillment, the avoidant is still living in the same emotional flatness, still protecting themselves from vulnerability, still unable to access deep satisfaction in relationships or life. The contrast reveals that the avoidant chose safety over happiness, and their ex chose the harder path of healing that led to actual fulfillment. The avoidant also recognizes that this happiness makes their ex more attractive to others and more capable of forming healthy connections. The person they took for granted, the person whose love they couldn't fully receive, has transformed into someone who will likely share that love and joy with someone more capable of appreciating and reciprocating it. This recognition triggers jealousy, regret, and the painful awareness that they had first access to something precious and squandered it through their fear and emotional limitations. When the loneliness they chose becomes unbearable, the avoidant has always framed their emotional distance as a choice, a preference for independence, a boundary around their autonomy, a form of self-protection they actively selected. But there comes a moment when the isolation they've engineered stops feeling like chosen solitude and starts feeling like unbearable loneliness. This shift in perception hits the avoidant with crushing force because it reveals that what they thought was strength was actually a prison they built for themselves. This realization often arrives in quiet moments, late at night, during a difficult day, or in experiences that would naturally be shared with a partner. The avoidant suddenly feels the weight of being alone, not by circumstance, but by design. They've pushed away someone who wanted to be present for exactly these moments, and now that person is permanently unavailable. The absence that felt like relief now feels like a void that nothing can fill. The psychological impact is devastating because it forces the avoidant to confront that they've engineered the very outcome they've spent their life trying to avoid. Their attachment wounds created a fear of abandonment so intense that they developed elaborate defenses against it. But in defending against abandonment, they've ensured it. They've abandoned themselves to loneliness through their inability to let anyone close enough to stay. The irony is crushing and impossible to rationalize away. The avoidant also realizes that the loneliness they're experiencing is uniquely painful because it comes with the knowledge that they had an alternative. They weren't forced into isolation by circumstance or lack of opportunity. Someone loved them, wanted to be with them, and tried repeatedly to create connection. The avoidant actively rejected this connection in favor of their protective isolation, and now they're experiencing the full weight of that choice. This loneliness is compounded by the recognition that it's likely to be permanent if the avoidant doesn't change fundamental aspects of their psychology. They see that their patterns don't just affect this one relationship, they're a template for how all their intimate relationships unfold. Unless something shifts internally, they're destined to repeat this cycle. Someone gets close, the avoidant feels suffocated, they create distance, the person eventually leaves, and the avoidant is left alone with their defenses and their loneliness. The hitting hard intensifies when the avoidant realizes that their former partner has moved beyond them into connection, while the avoidant remains stuck in isolation. Their ex has risked vulnerability again, opened their heart to new possibilities, and is likely experiencing, or will soon experience, the intimacy and partnership the avoidant rejected. Meanwhile, the avoidant is alone, not because they're between relationships, but because they're fundamentally unavailable for the depth of connection that creates lasting partnership. Moreover, the avoidant begins to question whether their prized independence is actually valuable, or just a consolation prize for their inability to tolerate intimacy. They see that true independence would include the ability to choose connection when it's healthy and available. But the avoidant doesn't have that choice. They can only choose distance. Their independence is revealed as a compulsion rather than a freely made selection, and this recognition strips it of the valor and sophistication they've attributed to it. The loneliness also brings a terrifying awareness of time passing. The avoidant realizes they've spent years protecting themselves from vulnerability while life moved forward. They're not getting younger. Their capacity for building new connections may be diminishing, and they've just lost someone who knew them deeply and loved them anyway. The window for experiencing genuine partnership may be closing, and they've spent their time building walls instead of bridges. This temporal dimension adds urgency and panic to the loneliness, making it feel not just painful, but potentially permanent. When they finally understand what love looked like, and it's too late, perhaps the most agonizing aspect of the avoidance awakening is when they finally develop the capacity to recognize and appreciate the love they were given, but only after it's been permanently withdrawn. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant experienced their partner's love through the distorted lens of their own fear and defense mechanisms. Acts of care felt like demands. Emotional expression felt like pressure. Commitment felt like suffocation. But now, with distance and loss creating clarity, the avoidant sees their former partner's behavior for what it truly was. Love in its most patient, generous, and enduring form. This recognition arrives like a series of realizations, each one more painful than the last. The avoidant remembers moments when their partner tried to connect and they shut down, and they now see those attempts not as intrusions, but as invitations to intimacy they were too afraid to accept. They recall their partner's patience with their emotional distance and recognize it as extraordinary tolerance and commitment rather than neediness or dependency. They think about the ways their partner accommodated their need for space and see it as respect and love, rather than as the baseline expectation they treated it as. The psychological pain of this recognition is acute because it comes layered with self-directed anger and grief. The avoidant is furious with themselves for being unable to see clearly when it mattered, for allowing their fears to blind them to what was being offered. They're grieving not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of all the moments of connection they rejected, all the opportunities for intimacy they deflected, all the love they couldn't allow themselves to receive. This understanding also forces the avoidant to confront the profound unfairness of what they put their partner through. They see now that their former partner was in relationship with someone who couldn't reciprocate, who took their love for granted, who treated their emotional offerings as burdensome rather than valuable. The avoidant recognizes the pain this must have caused, the rejection, the loneliness of loving someone emotionally unavailable, the slow erosion of hope and self-worth. This recognition brings overwhelming guilt. The hitting hard reaches its peak when the avoidant realizes that they're now capable of receiving the love their partner once offered, but that person is no longer offering it. The psychological growth or shift that's allowing them to finally see love clearly has arrived too late. They're ready for something that's no longer available to them. The timing is cruelly misaligned, and there's no way to go back and receive differently what was offered when it was actually being given. Moreover, the avoidant understands that this kind of love, patient, enduring, willing to see past defenses to the wounded person underneath, is extraordinarily rare. They didn't just lose a relationship, they lost someone whose capacity for love was exceptional. The avoidant sees that most people would have left much sooner, that their former partner's persistence and hope represented a depth of love and commitment that many people never experience. And they destroyed it through their inability to recognize its value while they had access to it. The avoidant is also haunted by the recognition that they taught their former partner to stop loving them. Through repeated rejection and emotional unavailability, they systematically dismantled their partner's willingness to stay open and vulnerable. The love didn't die suddenly. The avoidant slowly suffocated it through their consistent failure to reciprocate or appreciate it. This recognition brings a specific kind of guilt. They didn't just lose love through circumstance or incompatibility. They actively, though unconsciously, destroyed it through their own psychological limitations and defensive patterns. Finally, understanding love too late means the avoidant must carry this knowledge forward into a future without the person who loved them. They're now equipped to recognize love and value it, but they must live with the awareness that they failed to do so when it mattered most. This creates a form of regret that has no resolution. They cannot go back and love better, cannot undo the damage, cannot retrieve what they lost through their own blindness. They can only carry the painful wisdom forward, knowing that their awakening came at the cost of losing something irreplaceable, and that their understanding, though finally clear, is forever too late.